Hi everyone, welcome to video 1 of week 2 of Linguistic Creativity. This week's topic is exploring literariness, and I'm going to introduce this topic in this video and build on it a little bit in video 2. We started to talk about these ideas at the end of last week's live session, so hopefully this won't be brand new to you, but this topic is really going to explore thinking about concepts such as quality, and the distinctions between different types of texts, different types of writing, different types of storytelling, and who gets to decide whether something is literary, whether something is good or bad or high quality or low quality. So just to start off with a quick recap and an overview, this video is going to build on some ideas we talked about at the end of last week's session in relation to literary style. So we talked about style as a compilation of choices, the idea that whenever we talk, whenever we write, that there are choices consciously and unconsciously available to us all the time about which words we say and the order that we put them in, and the consequence of those choices creates a sense of style. One of those styles can be described as something which we might identify as being something which is literary, and various other choices can inform where we would sort of place other texts in relation to whether or not we think they're literary, whether we think they're creative or not. So because this is a linguistics module and this is the approach that we're taking, broadly speaking, this is an area of linguistics called stylistics, and this is a term that we're going to discuss in lots of detail as we move through the module. As linguists, we therefore believe that if we closely examine these choices and unpick them using linguistics, that we can start to understand a particular style, and in particular in relation to this, why we may take an assessment that something feels quite literary and other things perhaps feel less so. And we're therefore arguing that understanding how choices affect a style is a really powerful tool for both writers and for analysts. So ideas we're going to explore today are whether or not style is a product of textual features, so whether we can look at what somebody's said or what somebody's written and determine based on that whether or not something that we would consider being a literary style exists, or whether this is something which is driven by context and other information that perhaps we know about a particular text, such as the context in which it's produced, the purpose that it's been produced for, and who is the one doing the producing. So we're going to introduce ideas such as defamiliarization, foregrounding and poetic function, and we're going to argue that literariness is found across many forms of language, not just in relation to literature, and that's going to be something that in particular we're going to unpick a little bit in video 2. So there's going to be a few points in this video that I'm going to ask you to just pause and reflect on a few questions, and this in a moment is the first time I'm going to ask you to do this. So I'm going to display 2 genres below in a moment, and I want you to just first of all make an instinctive decision about which you would expect to be the more literary of these 2 genres. After that, I then want you to think about why you've made that instinctive judgment, and on reflection, do you think this instinctive reaction has a basis in reality or not? So do you think that your instincts are grounded in fact, or do you think that that's just some sort of gut reaction that you've had? So here they are. I'll give you a moment to pause the video, and then once you've had a chance to make a few notes on this, press play and we can continue. So most people, I would anticipate, would have said fiction as opposed to non-fiction is the thing that we would prototypically expect to be more literary. If you have said the opposite, that's absolutely fine, but I would encourage you to think about why it is that you've made that particular determination. And as we go through the video, I'll try and explain to you why I think most of you will have marked out fiction as opposed to non-fiction. But here's a slightly more elaborated version of this same task. I'm going to display for you now a series of genres, and what I want you to do is rank them in the order that you would expect them to be the most to the least literary. Okay, so pause the video again, and if you can rank them in that particular order, there are no right or wrong answers here. But again, once you've done this, if you can think about why it is you've placed those things in that particular order, that would be fantastic. Brilliant. Well done. Now I'd like you to reflect on a few more questions. How easy or difficult did you find that task? Were there any genres that you found it particularly easy? You thought, yeah, this is right up near the top, or this is right down near the bottom. Were there any that you found particularly difficult, or things that you weren't quite sure about which order to put them in, or you think that actually they could be interchangeable? Why do you think that that was? And reflecting on what you've just done, what factors did you consider when trying to rank these different genres? These are all ideas that we're going to pick up in the live session next week. Now I have one more question for you, and again I'm going to ask you to pause the video and just make a few notes in relation to this. When we talk about this idea about something being literary or non-literary, and obviously you have an instinctive sense of this because you've been able to complete those first two tasks, so something going on in your mind, some sort of conception about what you think literariness means has informed your decisions about where you've ranked those different genres. So what I'd now like you to reflect on is, why do you think that is, and can you be a little bit more specific? What kind of features would you typically designate as being literary? So these can be related to the language, so perhaps if you have put poetry quite high up the sort of the rank scale of those genres, what are the language features that you might anticipate would appear in poetry that perhaps wouldn't appear in things that you've put more further down that list? So typically people will often put things like scientific reports much further down than they will put poetry. And one reason that we could offer as linguists that as well, we expect metaphor, or we expect lots of wordplay, perhaps rhyme, to appear in poetry. Perhaps we designate these as being literary features, and we wouldn't expect them to be in scientific reports unless it was coincidental. Or you could think about this in relation to content. So again, thinking about poetry and the kinds of topics it covers compared to scientific reports. Is there something going on there that you think you would designate as something which you would typically associate with something being literary? So here are just a few examples, and I'm not going to go through them in any detail, but again, you might just want to pause the video and have a read through of these typical features. So various researchers over the years have been very interested in this topic of literariness, and they have come up with various features of language, various things that appear in different kinds of texts, which they have argued are associated with a literary style or something that we would judge to have a quality of literariness. You can see on the left-hand side of the screen, the ones in red are more typically associated with language features, and on the right, things that are more to do with content or contextual considerations. So take a moment to read through those. You don't need to agree with all of these, and in particular, it's important to bear in mind that all of the researchers who work in this area don't necessarily agree about all of these features, but just take a moment to have a read through and see what you think. So I discussed at the beginning of the video that we could think about style in these two different ways, as something which is textual or as something which is contextual. And just to return to the previous slide, you can see that these this division that I've made between the red and the blue, I'm going to explain to you now, are ways in which we could think about these red things as being on something where we could identify potentially literariness in a text using language features if we're looking at the things in red, or contextual things if we were looking at things in the blue. So Swan and Mabin have talked about this, and they say that style in language and creativity in language can be seen through these following two lenses, through a textual lens or a contextual lens. And I really like this lens metaphor, the idea of a particular way of looking at something which highlights to us particular things that we might want to look at. So we could approach a particular text and think, okay, I'm going to look at all of the textual features and I'm going to try and make a determination about the style and whether or not it feels like a literary style based on those textual features, and that's going to be the focus of my analysis. Or I want to focus on the contextual features and things that are more to do with the content. So let me take a moment to unravel these terms and define them a little bit more clearly for you now. So let's start with a textual lens. This approach to literary style and concepts around creativity, whether or not we think something is creative or not, conversations that we had in lots of rich detail last week, is an idea that views style as being something inherent, that it's something within a text that is stable, that we can look at and that we can make a judgment based on whether or not it has these particular features, that the text therefore is literary or is not literary. So it suggests that style is found in particular language features of a text, and the same goes for creativity. So it would suggest that if we judge something to have a creative style, to have this quality of creativity, that it's something to do with the language features, with those choices that I talked about at the beginning of the video. And that is one way in which we could approach analysing and making a determination, in particular a transparent, evidence-based determination about whether or not we think something is creative. So there's things in the text that we could point to and say, well, I think this has a literary style, or I think this is highly creative because it has these 4 features that have been identified as being part of this kind of style, and here, here, and here in the text are places where I can find them. This textual approach, therefore, is really interested in what a text is doing to make a reader or a listener feel this way. And there are terms such as defamiliarization, foregrounding, and self-referentiality, which this approach judges to be inherent features of literary text. So if we think something's literary and we go and look and examine that text closely, that we will find abundant examples of these features. So let me talk you through these 3 terms. So defamiliarization, foregrounding, and self-referentiality comes from an idea called Russian formalism. This was back in the early 20th century, around the sort of 1910s, 1920s, and there were a group of Russian scholars. There's some pictures of them here for you now if you want to imagine them having a chat with each other somewhere in Russia. And they very much subscribed to this view that that literariness, or something being creative, was something which was located in a text itself. So let's start with defamiliarization, and this is, I think, a really nice definition of it that Shklovsky came up with, and he argued that the technique of art, so he's not just talking about literary text here, he's also talking about visual works, but we are obviously focusing in this particular context on literary texts and written texts, spoken text. He says that the technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to take something which is familiar and defamiliarize it. That is where the term comes from. To make forms difficult, to increase the difficulty and length of perception, because the process of perception is an aesthetic end in itself and must be prolonged. So in essence, he argues that as soon as you defamiliarize something, it draws the focus of a reader or a listener, because they have to put in more mental effort to make sense of it. And in that process of drawing your attention and making you work harder for it, that is some sort of quality which we inherently associate with something being literary or something being creative. So you'll remember this text from the live session last week, which is a poem by E. E. Cummings. And Shklovsky would argue that there are many defamiliarizing features to this text, things like breaking up words across different lines, having capitals in places that we wouldn't necessarily expect them, and that this process of making it difficult for us to process, more difficult for us to understand, this drawing of our attention, is an act of defamiliarization, which he says is associated with a literary style. Now, what's particularly interesting about this, and we'll come on to this in the video in a moment, is that I know that not everybody agreed that this text was particularly creative when we did that ranking exercise, whether you were in my seminar or on Dave's seminar. This was something which sort of divided the room about whether or not it felt literary or non-literary, creative or not creative. So there's an argument that Shklovsky's putting forward here that we don't necessarily need to agree with. We could even agree that these techniques that Cummings has used are defamiliarizing, but we wouldn't necessarily need to follow on from that therefore it makes the text creative or therefore it makes it literary. Let's talk then about foregrounding, and Makarowski talked about this in particular, and he says again that this is an act of foregrounding, of drawing particular things within a scene to our attention, of playing around with our perception and what a reader or a listener's attention is drawn to. So you can see in this image that I've supplied for you at the bottom of the screen, that there are all sorts of different things that you could focus on within this particular artwork, and as you do so it changes what you can see. So it may be that you look at this and you see a tree, it may be that you see a lion and a gorilla looking at each other. There are also other things within this scene that we could choose to focus on, but that perhaps less naturally draw our attention, that aren't foregrounded in the same way. So we could see the birds at the top, and the one that people often spot last is down at the very bottom of the screen. If you look at the base of the tree trunk, there are a couple of fish swimming in something which is suggested to be a sort of a sea. So he would suggest that foregrounding is a technique that draws our attention, but that often there are other things in a text that are defamiliarized, that we have to slow down, we have to be deliberate in focusing our attention in order to notice. So we could think about perhaps the tree and the lion and the gorilla as being things which are highly foregrounded in our attention, things that are very obvious. So if we were to think about this in terms of a poem, perhaps we could think about a rhyme, something if it's got a very strong rhyme that is very, very noticeable, that is foregrounded within our attention. It's a sort of visual metaphor there, sort of brought to the fore. But there are also things going on there where perhaps we might have some sort of interesting metaphor or a reference to something, and that might be something that we might think about in terms of an analogy of looking at the fish or the birds, that there's something about literary style that the more attention you pay, the more interesting things you see, there are things within that which are also there to be discovered, to draw our attention, to make us think. And finally, Jacobson talked about this idea of self-referentiality, and he talked about functions of language as being sometimes poetic, so sometimes perhaps we produce text, we produce language, and the reason for that is to do something interesting, to play around, to get people to think about a particular idea. And sometimes, for instance, if you're getting on the bus and you are giving the driver some money, that there is a very practical function that we use language for there. And Jacobson argues that these utilizations of language which are more poetic tend to be things that we associate with being more literary and more creative, and things that where we're using language purely for a functional purpose tend to be more practical. And he talks about self-referentiality as something which is a quality of texts that sit on this more poetic end of the spectrum. So if we're thinking about writing a poem as opposed to having a functional interaction with somebody in order to let them get on a bus. And he says that poetic language therefore draws attention to itself and is more than just a vehicle of meaning. It's not just about performing a function to progress in our day-to-day lives. It's about something that draws our attention to the language itself. So hopefully you can see that there's quite a lot of connections between this idea of self-referentiality, foregrounding, and defamiliarization. They're all different aspects of talking about the same thing. So in other words, this school of thought, which I've told you is called Russian Formalism, claims that we can judge how literary a text is by looking at the degree of foregrounding and how self-referential the language is. So in a very crude sense, the more defamiliarization, the more foregrounding features, the more self-referentiality, the more poetic or literary a text can be judged to be. By contrast, however, we could come on and think about this idea about a contextual lens, and these are not necessarily mutually exclusive ways of thinking about judging literariness or creativity. Some people would argue that actually there are elements of both, but for the purpose of clarity, I'm now going to talk about the contextual lens as though it is something which is distinct. So for linguistic study, this refers to the wider context that language occurs in. And the following things may be relevant when we're making these kinds of judgment: the language producer and the receiver and the relationship between them and their identities. So we could think, for instance, about found poems as a really interesting example of this. So sometimes people will see a random compilation of perhaps graffiti on a bus stop. And if we look at it whilst we're waiting for a bus, we perhaps may judge contextually that that is not creative, it's not literary, it's not something which we would judge to be poetic or have particular features of defamiliarization. However, if we were to take someone who has designated themselves a poet and they were to write down all of those words of graffiti that they'd seen in a random order, put them onto a piece of paper and then present it to you as a poem, that you may then judge suddenly that this random compilation of words that you otherwise would have thought were not creative and not literary at all, because it's been presented to you in that manner and by someone who is presenting themselves to you as a poet, and therefore putting you as the receiver of that language in a position of reading a poem, that suddenly you may judge it to be literary in a manner that you wouldn't have done before. Now, the key distinction here is that the text the particular language features haven't changed, but the context has. So this would be something that people who subscribe to this school of thought would argue offers us evidence for the fact that it's not just about the textual features of something which facilitates this determination about whether or not something is literary or non-literary. We might also think about the physical setting or the temporal setting, the time at which we look at something, or the function of the language. Again, you may think that something is not particularly literary if you picked it up and read it at home, but if you were, say, in an A-level English literature class and the same text was presented to you, perhaps there's something about the physical setting, the time and the place in which you are, and the fact that a teacher who perhaps you might judge to have expertise in literature is somehow deeming this as worthy of study, and therefore perhaps that informs your decisions about whether or not you think it's literary or not. So this view, if we are to compare that to the textual lens, rather than viewing style as something which is objective, something which we can point to and say, these are the features that are there, and regardless of the context, this is literary or this is not, views style as something which is relative. Style is linked to the practical function of the language. How is this text being presented to us? Is it being presented to us as something that is literary or something that is not, something which is creative or something which is not? It views literary style as intentional communication and something which is dialogic. Dialogic means a sort of interaction. It's not just about an author or a speaker producing something, that actually the person who is listening to or reading that text also gets a say in whether or not they judge this style to be literary or otherwise. And to sort of round this up, I think I want to finish with this very interesting study from Jane Spiro back in 2011. And she was very interested in investigating this idea about this contextual lens a little bit more carefully. So she explored the relationship between authors' status and readers' judgment about literary quality. So this was an experiment in which she took a variety of work from established and well-known poets. So some had won Nobel Prizes for literature, some unpublished poets, so people who presented themselves as poets but perhaps hadn't had their work published yet, and work that was produced by students who previously hadn't had much experience of creative writing or poetry writing, who produced some poems in workshops. And what was really interesting about this study, and I think offers us a good solid research foundation, some evidence for the idea that this contextual lens is at least important or feeds into our additional consideration about textual features, is that she found that if she labelled the work with the author's identities, then typically the people who were published poets tend to be viewed as the best, and their poems were considered the most literary. The people who were unpublished were then ranked sort of second, and the people who had written the poems who had been produced in this one-off workshop were judged to be the sort of the least good and perhaps the least creative, the least literary works. However, as soon as she anonymised these texts and gave them to readers and just said, here are 8 poems, can you rank them from the ones you think are the best and the ones you think are the most literary, down to the ones that you think are the least good and the least literary, the judgments changed. And in fact, there were some of the participants who judged that the work produced by students in the creative writing workshops was suddenly the most literary, and things that had won a Nobel Prize for literature were the least literary. She also found that readers were unable to correctly identify which pieces belonged to which groups. So they were then told, okay, 3 of these poems were written by Nobel Prize winners, 3 of them were written by people who are poets but are unpublished, and 3 were produced by people who just wrote some poems for a bit of fun in a workshop. And she found that when you took this information away, they couldn't, based on their purely using this textual lens of looking at the text and the features in them, could not match up the works with the people who had produced them. So I think this is a really interesting study for us to reflect on when we're thinking about the interaction between what we want to look at as linguists, when we're thinking about what kind of factors inform whether or not something is literary or not, and how we make those judgments. Because Spiro's study certainly suggests that whilst this textual lens, thinking about these features, may well play a role in our judgments, that actually the contextual lens that is presented to us is really important too. So thank you very much for listening, and I really look forward to picking up these ideas with you in the live sessions next week. Thank you very much.